noticed how every article you read about the nonprofit sector starts very doom and gloom? Well, when I look out at the nonprofit sector, I see enormous reasons for hope. When GEO has been working in its Scaling What Works initiative over the course of the past 3 years, we've come in contact with many nonprofits who are achieving extraordinary things even under very difficult circumstances. These folks are sharing their skills and technology with other groups that need them. They're banding together with like-minded organizations in order to affect policy change. And they're spreading an idea through networks. And what do all these approaches have in common? They're collaborative. They don't rely on a single institution doing its work on its own. They rely on multiple institutions working with and through each other. Now, let's face it, collaboration is hard and it's frustrating, but also it can be powerful, even transformational. So GEO works on those practices that grant makers have the power to change that will ultimately help nonprofits the most. And when it comes to supporting collective action, we've got a bit of a way to go. And this is important work, though, because actually our ability to succeed in addressing some of our community's most pressing challenges is completely dependent on our ability to act together. So I want you to take a minute and think about a collaboration that either you've been a part of or that you've funded. And this can be one that just really was amazing, where you were able to accomplish things that you otherwise wouldn't have possibly been able to do. Or it can be one that was pretty crummy, where everyone was frustrated and wanted to just sort of take their ball and go home. Do you have one in mind? Okay. I bet you many of you it's a negative example, huh? I think those sometimes are easier to come up with than the positive ones. So what is it that distinguishes those collaborations that take flight from those that never really get off the ground? For GEO, we think it boils down to 3 things. And I'm interested to hear whether or not your experiences complies with ours. Now, the first among them is leaders who put the mission ahead of their egos or institutions. Now, that is a powerful thing, and it's all too rare. How many times have you guys watched a collaboration fall to pieces because of turf or ego? Probably a little bit too frequently. It's sort of an organization-centric mindset that we need to shift. Now, a quick anecdote. A couple times a year, I teach a nonprofit class at Northwestern University, and I always ask these students, well, what do you want to do when you grow up, I guess it is. And they say, I want to start a nonprofit. And they don't say they want to make certain that healthcare is seen as a universal human right, or they want to make certain that every poor kid has a chance to get a fantastic education. They want to found something, and it doesn't really matter what. So if we are going to make powerful progress on these complex issues, we've got to turn that notion on its head. We've got to get leaders who are willing to contribute to something that's bigger than themselves, and that they're willing to do so without ever seeing their name in lights or getting credit. We're going to be better served when we have leaders who de-emphasize individual power and individual prestige and share power and are willing to share the credit and the prestige. Now, this is a kind of leadership. Some people call it collective leadership. Some people call it collaborative leadership. I think it's the same as what Robert Greenleaf talked about as servant leadership. And it's the kind of leadership that our sector needs the most. Now, what does this look like in action? For grant makers, first of all, we can find and reward those leaders who put the mission consistently ahead of their own institutions or their own ego. Leaders like Daryl Hammond of Kaboom. Now, Daryl Hammond does not strive to be the biggest or only ship in the ocean. He wants to be surrounded by a vast fleet of ships that are all moving in the same direction. That's why he cares about the success of colleague organizations, and he'll even drive resources their way if that's the best way to get every kid in the nation a safe place to play. So in addition to supporting leaders like Daryl, we can also kind of look at ourselves and see if there's anything that we as foundations are doing that get in the way of the work, where we might be putting our own institutions ahead of the work that needs to be done. Now, this might mean that we have to do things like kind of give up on that hope of directly attributing a result to the dollars that we've contributed, and instead be okay with the fact that we contributed to something bigger along with a host of others. It might mean that we have to let go of some grant-making practices where the timelines are off for what you're trying to get done, or the processes are off for what the work really requires. But in order to put your mission first, that's what it's really going to take. There's a foundation, the Energy Foundation, that really exhibits the kind of mission-first attitude that I'm talking about. And they're probably the biggest foundation that most of us have never even heard of. They got started when the MacArthur Foundation, the Pew Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation were all interested in helping try to reverse America's energy crisis, but they realized that they didn't themselves have the expertise to do that. So they put $100 million in over 10 years to create the Energy Foundation. And the Energy Foundation has very consciously been a bit of a behind-the-scenes player. They're not trying to grow the Energy Foundation, they're trying to grow the field of energy philanthropy, which is quite different. And they're also supporting a network of advocates and organizations that are advocating for policy change. And frankly, they're the funders behind the advocates that successfully put into place the new fuel efficiency standards that are going to remove hundreds of tons of carbon dioxide from our environment over the course of the next 20 years. So the first thing that's important to collaboration is the presence of leaders who put mission first. The second criteria is relationships built on trust. Now, the folks who put mission first are also usually pretty great relationship builders. So these two things kind of go together. But relationships of trust take time to build. They do not happen instantaneously. And they require that you're candid and that you're willing to have tough conversations. And that's kind of hard. But there's a foundation that has been working really hard to build those relationships of trust that enable deep collaboration, and that's the Barr Foundation in Boston. Now, the Barr Foundation has been giving this gift of time to do this relationship building to a series of fellows every year for the past 9 years. So they bring together 12 fellows for a 3-month sabbatical program that includes a learning tour to the Global South. Now, the interesting difference about this fellows program is that these fellows are actually told not to do anything together. They're just supposed to go through this experience together. They don't want to rush to action before the relationships get built. And the stories that you hear about this fellowship are just absolutely transformational. People who used to be seen as kind of enemies or part of those turf wars have been able to bridge that gap and work very well together. So a couple of accomplishments that fellows have been able to do together, a couple fellows came together to start the first bilingual high school in Boston. And a couple other fellows pulled together to put forward a Promised Neighborhoods grant application, and they were successful. So these are unexpected outcomes, but they're only made possible because these fellows were willing to rely on each other and ask for each other's help when they were facing a big challenge. So relationships built on trust are the second key criteria to collaborations that work. Now, the third criteria is actually the one on which the other two rely. And to talk about it requires that I make a bit of a personal disclosure about a failing in my own leadership. So when I came to GEO, I realized that we're working in a bit of a fishbowl. We're grantmakers for effective organizations, after all. So clearly we have to be a model of effectiveness ourselves. And we work very hard at that. But to be frank, until recently, I was caught in the exact same trap that most nonprofit leaders are caught in when it comes to collaboration. In my heart and soul, I value collaboration. I know it's incredibly important, but until recently, I had not made the institutional changes I needed to make that a priority at GEO. So we were only doing collaboration in what I would call a surface level way, an easy way. So what do you think the change was that I had to make collaboration a real, true priority? For the first time in GEO's history, I built in some organizational slack. Now, some people might call that margin or bandwidth or wiggle room or whatever you want to call it. But I like to think about it as the time when the magic's possible, when the magic could happen. Because you're taking a break from the day-to-day to focus on those back burner items that continue to get shoved further back on the back burner because they're not urgent, but they're absolutely important. So what does it take for grant makers to help build in this kind of organizational slack that would be key to collaboration? And it's not only key to collaboration, actually, it's key to innovation. It's what enables us to learn and to adapt to changing circumstances. So how can grant makers help support that kind of breathing room? It's only built in one way, and that is when nonprofits have access to significant streams of unrestricted dollars. That's the only way. When all signs, GEO has been working for 12 years on a host of different issues, leadership development, collaboration, effectiveness, scale, all of these things, and all signs point back to the truth that for nonprofits to be truly effective, they need to have reliable, flexible dollars delivered over the long term. Now for GEO, that comes in the form of a dozen or so grant makers who give us general operating support, and our community of nearly 450 members who pay us membership dues. So I realize how unbelievably lucky we are to be able to do this, because most nonprofits are so financially strapped that they couldn't even consider it. There are many foundations. The good news is that there are many foundations that are starting to embrace this approach, that they're prioritizing general operating support. They're giving like 100% of their grants as operating support, or at least significant numbers. Weingart Foundation is one. I know that they give money here in San Diego. Deaconess in St. Louis, the Boston Foundation, and the list goes on. But I want to tell you quickly about a foundation that's found another creative way to help some of their top leaders in their portfolio find a little bit of organizational slack. And that's the Durfee Foundation. They, through their Stanton Fellowship, provide $75,000 over a 2-year period for just a couple of the top leaders in their community to give them time to clear the decks, to work on a problem that they are particularly well suited for, if only they could find the time and space. And just extraordinary things have developed. These folks have to take a month and go and do this, and the rest of the organization is supported in other ways as they work on this piece of work. And one of the results, a Stanton Fellow, is the person who created Ciclovia up in LA, which is where they close down the streets and let pedestrians and cyclists take over miles of LA streets a couple times a year. So that was, key to the mission of his organization, but not something that he ever would have had time to do unless he had that organizational slack. So my question for you is, what would you do if you could clear the decks for a little while? What would your top performing grantees do? I bet you it would be pretty powerful. Because there's absolutely no end of what we can accomplish together. What we can start by doing is finding and supporting those leaders who put the mission first and giving them the time and space they need to collaborate and innovate and learn from others who share their ultimate goals. And in doing so, together, we create a sector where nonprofits wouldn't think about going it alone, where they're regularly collaborating with one another, because that's what's in the best interest of the people that they serve. And where grant makers trust the organizations that they work with enough to give them the flexible dollars that they need to spur collaboration and innovation. And where grant makers wouldn't even consider developing their own strategies in isolation. Because when we do that, That's when our communities thrive. So I want to end by thanking you for the deep, good work that you're doing in this community every day, and by challenging you to just try to do a bit more, a bit better on behalf of the people that you serve. Thank you.